Welcome to Lesson 5, our summary. And let's go over and we'll see what we've talked about in these first 4 lessons. A sentence is a group of words that can be changed into a yes or no question. Every sentence has 3 forms. For example, affirmative, this video is about English grammar. Negative, this video is not about English grammar. And a yes-no question, is this video about English grammar? Using this idea, we can find the 2 X-word places using these 3 forms. Many affirmative sentences have an X-word. All negative sentences have an X-word together with not to make negative. And yes-no questions begin with an X-word. So this is great for us because the subject of a sentence is the word or words between the 2 X-word places. And this is always true. Now, we also talked about shifters, and a shifter is a word or group of words that can shift from the front of a sentence to the end, or from the end of a sentence to the front, and not change the meaning of a sentence. And a sentence can have more than one shifter. We saw some examples of this when we saw, for example, people can exercise, or I am exercising today at 6 o'clock. Today and at 6 o'clock are 2 shifters. I could say, today I'm exercising at 6, or at 6 I'm exercising today, or today at 6 I'm exercising. Any of those versions of the sentence basically mean the same thing because shifters can move around from one end or to the front or from the front to the end and not change the meaning of the sentence. Then we saw that we have the predicate in between the subject and the shifter. So what we've said is every sentence has a shifter place in the front. Every sentence has a shifter place at the end. We may or may not have words in those shifter places, but it's important to think about the sentence as having these 2 front and end shifter places. Every sentence also has 2 X-word places, and between those 2 X-word places is the subject. And finally, between the subject and the end shifter place is what we've termed and called the predicate. And if there is no end shifter, the place is still there. The predicate goes to the end of the sentence. So, that brings us to the 5 ties. And we broke this up and presented it in 5 sections, A, B, C, D, and E. And we saw that subjects and X-words tie. Not all X-words, but some X-words. X-words like am and are and is and was and were and do and does and have and has, they all tie with subjects. It's interesting, these are X-words that actually have more than one form. Am, are, is are 3 forms of the same X-word. Do and does are 2 forms of the same X-word. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. We saw that X-words tie with time. And oops, I see that I left out my past forms. But we have 20 X-words. And all the X-words tie with time. So for example, in the present, am, are, is, do, does, can, may, will, should, shall, must, have, and has. But in the past, we have was and were, we have did, could, might, would, and had tie with the past. Verbs and subjects can tie. Not all verbs, but the S form, for example, or no S form, ties with subjects like I, you, we, and they. and the S form ties with subjects like he, she, and it. Verbs can tie with time. The no S form ties with the present. The S form ties with the present. The past form ties with a definite time in the past. It's interesting to note that the S form and no S forms each have two ties. The S and no S forms tie with subjects. They also tie with verbs, with time. The past form only has one tie, a definite time in the past. Finally, we saw that X words can tie with verbs. For example, we have a base form of the verb, and that ties with X words like do, does, did, may, might, will, would, can, could, should, shall, and must. We have the ing form of a verb, which ties with am, are, is, was, and were. And we have the dtn form of a verb, which ties with have, has, had, am, are, is, was, were. I know that these are a little bit different names than you often hear. Very often we hear present participle and past participle. We'll talk about why we're not going to use those terms, but it's the same verb forms that we're talking about that have the same ties. That doesn't change because we're still describing English. And then we mentioned very quickly that we call it DTN form because the verbs in this form almost always end with D, T, or N. All regular verbs in this form finish with D, and then some of the irregular verbs finish with D, some with T, and some with N. This is our review. It's very short, but it gives you a rough idea of what we've talked about. You now have a very good idea about what the basic kind of sentence looks like in English. And actually, this is the easy part of the language, because the hard part of English and the difficulty in English is what we can do with these basic parts and how we can combine them and use them in different ways. Please complete Lesson 5, Exercise 1. Check over those answers. That'll give you a good idea of how comfortable you are with this information. And then as we begin Lesson 6, we'll start to see a lot more about how English looks and how about the language behaves. I hope you find this useful, helpful, and you've enjoyed it, and we'll continue.